Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us virtually today at the NIC 2020. What a year to be hosting the NIC, and glad to have all of you here joining us, spending your time over Zoom with us to hear more about how our systems of humanitarian protection have been under attack, what we can do to rebuild, and what our hopes and dreams are for the future. Today, we have the Refuge No More panel discussion. And my name is Lisa Sherman Nikolaus, and I'm the Executive Director of the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition. I'm really proud and humbled to be able to moderate this panel today, where we have four amazing speakers who are going to walk us through America's human rights crisis in recent years and share with us how we can move forward and recast our vision for what it means to welcome individuals and families who are fleeing persecution and violence. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started. We do want to invite you to reflect on how your work connects to the discussion today. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat, to share insights throughout the chat function. And we'll be taking questions, or I'll be asking questions to each of the panel members after their presentations. So before we get started, just a little bit of context setting for you. You'll go to the next slide, Nejra. What a 4 years. It has been incredibly hard for our communities, particularly our systems of protection and our ability to welcome people who are fleeing persecution and violence. Our refugee resettlement program has been completely gutted. Our asylum system has come to a grinding halt. And our temporary protected status has been upended, as we know that the Trump administration has tried to utterly undermine and betray the things that have helped us to welcome the world's most vulnerable, to be able to live up to our aspirational value of being a beacon of hope for all in the middle of one of the worst humanitarian crises that our world has ever seen, from climate change to civil wars and other situations that have made people have to uproot their lives and leave their home. We've started out the last 4 years with the Muslim and refugee bans, which really shook the country to its core. We also had the asylum ban, the TPS erosion, the Remain in Mexico policy, are just among a few of the policy changes that we saw at the federal level that really aim to destroy our systems of humanitarian protection. Not only that, but we also know that COVID has hit our communities especially hard. A lot of immigrants and refugees are working in essential jobs, whether it's in meatpacking plants or in the healthcare industry. And we've seen the spread of the pandemic really hit home to our communities in these spaces. But as I said earlier, our need for humanitarian protections has never been greater, especially as we're seeing really dramatic climate change happening, not only just here in our home country, but all across the world. And the need for people to uproot and find safety and protection is more pressing than ever. Next slide. And similarly with the refugee admissions program, we have hit historic lows with the number of arrivals that we're able to welcome every year increasingly decreasing. And we started out with welcoming more than 95,000 refugees a year to less than 12,000 in the fiscal year 2020. And of course, this has had huge impact on our ability to welcome, our infrastructure, to resettle refugees. If you'll go to the next slide. Some of the impact here that we've seen in Tennessee, which I know has been felt all across the country, is the shutting down of resettlement programs, the laying off of resettlement staff. And it's going to take a lot of investment, resources, and capacity to rebuild that infrastructure and be able to scale up our efforts to welcome as many refugees as we can. Next slide. But even before the Trump era, We also know that there's been a steady undercurrent of opposition that really gave rise to what we saw under the Trump administration. So as we think about what it's going to take to rebuild the infrastructure, to increase our capacity, we also need to rebuild support and recast a vision for what it means to welcome. We can't go back to the status quo. We have to ensure that we're softening the ground and laying the foundation for reaching the aspirational value of being a beacon of hope and ensuring that we're able to not just overcome, but to really rebuild support for welcoming people fleeing persecution and violence. Next slide. I think one of the really important things to remember about the last 4 years, however, is that we've really discovered an incredible resiliency of our communities. We've fought back at every turn in the courts, in the streets, and at the ballot box. We've built power, we've protected our people, and we've shaped the narrative. Next slide. And refugees, asylees, TPS holders have been politicized. We've participated in the electoral process, leading the way, especially in the November 2020 elections, at turning the tide in the country, leading in advocacy, joining for Refugee Day on the Hill, obtaining consent from county mayors and from governors in response to Trump's executive order to undermine our ability to welcome, and joining the broader movement for racial justice. We now know we have to not only rebuild that infrastructure, but as I said earlier, really recast a vision and build support from the ground up. It's not going to be easy, but we want to be sure that we don't go back to status quo. So without further ado, I want to introduce our panelists today who are going to dive in a little bit deeper and share their brilliance with us. So today we have Adam Hunter, who's the Executive Director of Refugee Council USA. He has more than 15 years experience on migration, national security, and international affairs through different positions in government, foundations, think tanks, and fellowships. Jennifer Quiqley leads human rights first advocacy work to protect the rights of refugees and ensure the United States commits to refugee protection at home and abroad, including access to asylum protections and resettlement. Jennifer has a long history of working on Burma with the U.S. Campaign for Burma and the Women's League of Burma, and she's testified before Congress and been quoted in numerous print, television, and online news sources. Nejra Sumic is the National Field Manager with We Are All America and the Delegate of Arizona with Refugee Congress. She is a former refugee from Bosnia and Herzegovina and has overcome a great deal of adversity. She is most passionate in empowering other refugees, helping transform policies, and organizing communities. Oscar Chacon is a co-founder and executive director of Alianza Américas. He has served in leadership positions at the Chicago-based Heartland Alliance for Human Needs and Human Rights, the Northern California Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, and the Boston-based Centro Presente, as well as several other community and international development organizations. He served on multiple advisory committees to national and international processes, including the civil society consultation process, to the Global Forum on Migration and Development and the World Social Forum on Migration. You can read all about these panelists in the NIC bio guide on the website and learn more about what they have to offer today. So as we think about where we've been in the last 20 years and where we are now, I want to turn it over to Jennifer Quiqley from Human Rights First and Adam Hunter from Refugee Council USA. They're going to walk us through what it's going to take to rebuild our infrastructure and our ability to welcome in order to restore our systems of humanitarian protection. Jennifer, over to you.
Thanks, Lisa. Okay, so I want to talk first a bit about what we're confronting, right? And so sort of what it is that the Trump administration has done that we're going to sort of need to dismantle and then build back a better system. And so this sort of falls into three categories: eligibility for asylum, access to asylum, and then redress for victims of the harm of the Trump administration's asylum policies. And so first off, an eligibility. So that means, if you came to the United States and you are seeking asylum protection, that you would be denied because the Trump administration put in place a series of executive orders, right? Like the asylum ban, which said if you enter the United States between a port of entry as opposed to through a port, that would automatically make you ineligible for asylum. Regulations. So regulations were a big tool of this administration, in which, for instance, you had an asylum regulation that said you would be ineligible for asylum if you, for instance, had wow, there are so many to list. And so if you had crossed between a port of entry, then you wouldn't be eligible for work authorization, right? And so there's a lot of punishment that the Trump administration pursued through regulations to say that if you came to this country seeking protection, that you should be punished basically for that and you should not be granted protection. Lastly is something that's sort of very technical DC type term. It's called Attorney General certifications. So for those of you who are immigration lawyers, you're very familiar with the immigration courts and how a case can be taken from the Board of Immigration Appeals by the Attorney General, and he just rewrites immigration law through that case and issues the certification of the case. The most famous and most destructive of the several AG certifications that the Trump administration pushed through was Matter AB. And this is to basically deny asylum claims to individuals who say that gender is the reason why they were persecuted or they fear persecution, right? Or gang-related violence. But they even went as so far as to say that if you were persecuted because you're related to someone who's also persecuted, that you wouldn't be eligible for asylum. And so what we are trying to do is ensure that the Biden transition team will understand the entire swath of asylum executive orders, proclamations, regulations, AG certifications that all need to be undone to restore asylum eligibility and make sure it's in line with the actual refugee convention, with our domestic law that says who is eligible for asylum. And so this is something that we're hoping we can get the Biden administration to do within the first 100 days of their term, so that anybody who is going to be before the asylum office or is going to be before the immigration courts has a fair shot, a fair chance at proving that they are somebody who has a fear of persecution. So the next issue facing us is access, right? And so the Trump administration has just a huge number of programs to prevent people from being able to even enter the United States, to get to the point to be able to make a case right before an immigration judge or before an asylum officer. And so, at least I mentioned earlier, there's the Remain in Mexico program known as the Migrant Protection Protocols, which forced anyone who came seeking asylum back into Mexico to wait until their immigration court hearings, facing a lot of danger as they were forced to be there for months, sometimes even years. The next is asylum cooperative agreements, where we said we would force people to go to Guatemala, El Salvador, or Honduras and seek asylum there, not here in the United States. And so what we're looking to do is not only have an end to programs that force people back into dangerous situations, but to build a better system, right? And to promote the notion that if you come here, you should be treated humanely, that you should not be held in detention, and that you should have a fair shot at being able to access asylum protections in the US. And then lastly is redress. And so the issue of redress that's a catch-all phrase for how it is that we can help those that we harmed, right? And so 4 years of the Trump administration has led to a countless number of individuals and families who have been harmed by these policies, right? They came here seeking protection. We either returned them to their home country to danger, we sent them to a third country for danger, we left them in Mexico in danger, or we outright denied them asylum. In some cases, we provided them with what's called withholding of removal, or protections under the Convention Against Torture. But that protection actually doesn't allow you to live here permanently, like asylum does, nor does it allow you to bring your family here. So say you made that dangerous journey yourself and wanted to spare your young children or your spouse that journey, hoping to be granted asylum and then fly them here safely. These individuals were denied that opportunity because of the transit ban. And so what we hope to push the Biden administration do is to provide access to asylum for all those individuals we harmed, that we fly them back to the United States if they are no longer here, that we expedite processing for those who are granted withholding to get them asylum so that they can be reunited with their families. And so it's very important that we look at all three of these situations, right? Eligibility to asylum, access to asylum, and then redress for those who were harmed by the US government over the past 4 years. Something we consider to be our responsibility as Americans. So the next thing I want to talk about is the impact of COVID. And so we had a slew of these horrible policies, and then COVID hit, devastating everyone across the globe. And asylum seekers are no exception to that. So the Trump administration in March put what we call a border shutdown in place, using COVID to justify that. So if you were traveling to the United States, whether it be for business, for personal reasons, you could come across our border, as long as you weren't an asylum seeker. If you were an unaccompanied child or asylum seeker, we shut down the border. And instead, if somebody had crossed between a port, we expelled them. And so we call them expulsions. And so thousands upon tens of thousands of individuals have just been expelled from the United States during the COVID crisis without any opportunity to make their claim. And so it's important that going forward, that the Biden administration look at this border shutdown and reevaluate what is the safe way during a pandemic to process asylum seekers. We've heard from public health experts over the past several months say that it is possible to process asylum seekers during COVID if the correct safety protocols are in place. And so it's incredibly important that we not leave asylum seekers in danger and that we reevaluate based on scientific and medical expertise how to safely process people. So the next issue, of course, is economic, right? We may be confronting a situation in which Americans who typically open their hearts and their homes and their communities to asylum seekers are very worried about, say, potentially the economic impact of more individuals seeking work in communities at a time when our communities are hurting. And so this is an opportunity for us to sort of show that we can do two things at once, right? We can walk and chew gum, right? We can find a way to safely protect our communities, to bring back economic opportunities, as well as showing that we are still a humane country that welcomes and protects individuals who are in need of it. Lastly, the last step I want to talk about is the one that we are most concerned about, right? And that's political calculations versus humanitarian protection. So in addition to COVID, there is a lot of concern that once Biden takes office, that the fact that so far he has indicated that he is pro-immigration, that we will see an increased numbers of migrants and asylum seekers at our southern border, that it'll be portrayed by some media outlets as a surge, as chaotic, as an invasion, and that the Biden administration is going to need to take steps to show that we can quickly, efficiently, and orderly process migrants and asylum seekers that come across our southern border. It's imperative that we convey to the Biden administration a sense of welcome, that we don't want to sacrifice providing humanitarian protection for efficiency or expediency, right? And so, of course, we all want efficiency, but the issue is that expediency is not the same as efficiency when it comes to processing at the border. And so we need to be careful to ensure that the Biden administration hears from us, hears from our communities, hears from all of us to know that we want asylum seekers to come in, but that does not mean placing them in detention in dangerous conditions, not only in COVID, but in normal times. And we don't want expedited processing that ensures that these individuals don't have access to an attorney and do not have the time that they need to make their asylum claim. So it's critically important that we, as immigrants and immigrant advocates, convey to the new Biden administration how important it is that humanity and our humanity is at stake, and that we need to ensure that people have access to the protection systems that we must restore here in the United States. So thank you all for taking the time to listen. I turn it back over to Lisa.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's really interesting. Everything you shared. I'd love to hear a little bit from Adam. Similar kind of analysis around our refugee resettlement program. It's something that here at Turk we do a lot of refugee organizing and work really closely with resettlement agencies. And we've seen firsthand the damage that has been done here in our own communities from the gutting of the refugee resettlement, and just the pain that it has caused for families who are waiting to be reunited with their loved ones. So would love to hear from you a little bit about your assessment of the refugee resettlement program, how you all are preparing, the impact that it's had. And then I'll have a few questions for both
Sounds
of you.
great. Well, thank you, Lisa, and thanks to the NPNA team for the invitation. This is actually my 8th NIC, so I'm really pleased to be here with you all today. My first was back in Boston in 2010. Missed a couple along the way, but glad to be able to join this virtually. Backing out in terms of context, I think it's important to hit upon, Lisa, what you hit on the top, which is that we're facing today a global humanitarian and refugee crisis with nearly 80 million people who have been displaced, about 26 million of those being identified by UNHCR as refugees. And this doesn't even account for the impact that we should all be bracing for of the COVID-19 pandemic and its attendant consequences on economic well-being in many countries. Now, the US has had a long history as a humanitarian leader with strong bipartisan support. The need for this leadership was really acute in 2015 as we saw a lot of refugee and migrant flows into Europe, in part due to the Syrian civil war. And it's worth remembering that the Obama administration in 2016 concluded with a major UN conference to catapult international engagement on these issues, beginning two processes that resulted in both formalized compacts at the end of 2018 approved by the UN General Assembly, both the Global Compact for Safe and Orderly Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees. The Trump administration, of course, has failed both to carry forth US leadership on these issues, but actually going beyond that, took active and cruel steps to undermine our own protection regimes and programs here in the United States. And we heard about the asylum side from Jennifer, and I'll talk here a little bit on the resettlement side, where we've also been seen as a global leader, and until very recently have resettled on average 95,000 refugees a year, more than every other resettlement country combined on an annualized basis. So going back to the beginnings of the Trump administration, we can recall that within 1 week of inauguration, we had a Muslim ban that was reducing also admissions for refugees for the coming year, taking a change from the Obama administration posture, banning all refugees from entering for a period of 120 days to review the program, and banning Syrians indefinitely. Later that year, once the program was able to resume, there was a series of what's the quote unquote extreme vetting protocols that were introduced to make it more challenging for refugees to be screened in a timely way. Also in 2017, the State Department issued regulations that would restrict the resettlement offices who could resettle refugees if they were resettling fewer than 100 per year. They would have to close. USCIS also issued some rules to make the family reunification process, the follow to join process, more difficult, and even as late as this week, instituted some new interview requirements for these populations. And a significant executive order came in late 2019, under which the Trump administration sought to require state and local consent for states to affirmatively say that they would accept refugees as part of being part of the resettlement program. I think maybe unexpectedly to them, we were able to have 43 governors and many more local officials through a nationwide collaborative effort in partnership with many of the organizations as part of the NPNA network and otherwise to really marshal the advocacy and stand up to support resettlement in their respective states. That executive order is obviously not likely to be carried forward in the Biden administration, but is also enjoined by a court and is subject of ongoing litigation. In addition, even within the program parameters that are normally operational, the Trump administration has operated the program in poor faith. Every September, the administration is to meet meaningfully with Congress and to set a refugee presidential determination for the next fiscal year. During the Trump administration, they've set that number lower and lower, a new record every year, and we're down to 15,000 as a ceiling for the current fiscal year. Not only that, the consultations have not been meaningful. They've been pro forma and not engaging members and the real issues at hand. And they've come late in the past 2 years, which meant the lapse in timeliness ground the program to a halt. In 2019, this in fact resulted in refugees and families being scheduled for travel that had to be canceled off their flights, rebooked, risked falling out of security checks. It was a real chaotic scene, so much so that this year, the State Department was able to push back and actually had an extended moratorium, concerned that they would be running into that same problem again. Also, in the past couple of years, the Trump administration has not only lowered the numbers of annual refugees it would admit, but limited the allocations to very stringent categories and taken away prior flexibility. So we're not even serving and not even admitting those numbers that they themselves have set out to achieve. And what does all this mean? Of course, like the impact is multitude on individuals, separating families, not able to join, and resettlement infrastructure, as Lisa noted at the top, has also suffered locally. Because of the decrease in flows, we've lost about 100 sites across the country that have either closed or had to cancel out their programs, and have lost a lot of talent and capacity to engage in resettlement and community integration. All the while, as we know, refugees have demonstrated, alongside other immigrants, being critical community members, critical essential workers. A recent report from the New American Economy Initiative showed that there were more than 176,000 refugees alone working in the medical field, and another 175,000 working in the food supply chain. So overall, these messages under the Trump administration, at a time when refugees are our community members, they are our neighbors, and they are critical beacons for what America can, should, and ought to be. We're sending a tremendous message of unwelcome. We are withdrawing U.S. leadership from global engagement on humanitarian protection issues. And we frankly lost our credibility and moral compass when we're pursuing these issues of human rights abroad. And what does it say to the rest of the world when we, the United States of America, are separating children from their families at our border, or pursuing indefinite detention for vulnerable families, right? What human rights voice can we bring to bear? So I think that under a Biden administration, as we can expect, a lot of big opportunities to do things differently. The road forward will be difficult, as Jennifer has outlined. And in the resettlement realm, we're looking for an incoming Biden administration to quickly reset the refugee resettlement number to 100,000, to restore the allocations based on region and vulnerability. That is to include referrals from UNHCR, which have currently been blocked, and a commitment to the infrastructure and executive coordination and the interagency coordination that it will take to ensure more seamless overseas and domestic infrastructure can be rebuilt. We in our communities know those in my network, for example, that are administering these programs, as well as the communities and affiliates in which they're working. There is a reservoir of support. There are actors and partners willing and eager to engage, and just having the certainty, the funding to plan, and the statement that more refugees will be coming will be in everybody's interest. Also, we're concerned for some of the same reasons that Jennifer is, about how much the executive has wielded its authority and frankly abused its authority on humanitarian protection issues. So we also are mindful of wanting to set some statutory processes. In particular, there's been legislation proposed, the GRACE Act, that would set a statutory floor for refugee admissions, and a much more comprehensive Refugee Protection Act that really has the potential to embody a lot of the legislative fixes that in the refugee realm, and to the point that Jennifer was speaking to, took away some of the employment authorization and other things piecemeal. It would really establish a statutory basis, an expectation for how we conduct and provide protection for these programs. So as RCUSA, we're looking forward with community members to moving this agenda forward. We want to partner with communities in particular to be mindful and resist the potential backlash that could amount at the state and local level, and know that it's going to take a lot of pressure and a lot of prioritization for the incoming administration and any leadership in Congress on both sides of the aisle to make all of this happen. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the questions.
Thanks, Adam. I'm really glad you mentioned that about the need to rebuild, support, and really work with local communities. That's something that we in Tennessee have experienced and known for a very long time, and have to be playing defense a lot at our state legislature and defending our ability to welcome and the refugee resettlement program. And especially during the consent process, we saw a very loud backlash to our governor consenting to welcome refugees, and lots of anti-refugee resolutions crop up at the local level in communities that had never resettled a refugee in our history. And so would love to hear a little bit more about what you think is needed, both from the Biden administration and from resettlement organizations as they're thinking about scaling up their efforts, opening up new offices. What do you think the kind of work that needs to happen at the local level to ensure that we're building support as we work to implement these national changes?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and there's no one single answer on this. As your slide pointed out at the outset, when more than half the nation's governors were resisting Syrian refugees in 2015, this was a real wake-up call for the community that I think that is a fair criticism, operated a little under the radar. Resettlement was seen a bit outside of other immigration processes and its own little thing. But that is no longer the mindset. And we have lost, I think, over the past couple of years, the narrative on who refugees are, how they got here, how they contribute, and how our lives are enriched because they are here. We've allowed this dubious conflation with national security threats and now with public health threats in ways that has engendered fear, that has been fomented for intentional division. And we haven't had the broad base of support locally to stand up and speak the truth, and refugees speaking to their own positions and their own aspirations in community. So we're trying to do that through our strategic communications work in partnership with groups like Refugee Congress and Refugee Advocacy Lab, so that we can engage the experiential voice so that they can be best positioned to engage civically in their community, and that we can broaden communities of support outside of traditional immigration circles too, who understand, employ, care about, and feel stakeholdership for these programs. So it's really an open question to which I look for everyone for partnership.
Awesome. Yeah, and I know a lot of MP&A partners are doing really amazing work with us all across the country and working to rebuild support and really organize refugee communities to ensure that their voice is heard at their state legislatures, at the ballot box, and beyond. So Jennifer, similarly, here in Tennessee in 2018, we saw a huge backlash, much like the rest of the country, around the migrant caravan, with our U.S. Senator Marsha Blackburn writing an op-ed that equated the migrant caravan to an invading force. And so there's just been a lot of erosion of support for people who are coming through our border to seek asylum and to flee the kind of violence that we see and experience in Central America. The same reason my family left Guatemala in 2001. So would love to hear a little bit from you about what you think needs to happen at the local level to rebuild support for asylum and for our broader systems of humanitarian protection.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I think what we've seen over the past 4 years in this country on a local level, on a state level, on a national level is a dichotomy of those who have run with President Trump's rhetoric, right, that people who come in and apply for asylum, that right there they are fraudsters, right, and that they are trying to use loopholes in a system that's quite easy to get access to, right, and of course, for everybody who is familiar with our asylum system, even before the Trump administration, it's almost laughable if it wasn't causing so much damage, because it's incredibly difficult to win an asylum claim here in the United States. But at the same time, when you saw the family separation crisis, when we saw kids in cages, and you saw sort of how incredibly abusive the US government was, you also had people rising up to speak out and be like, that's not who we are, right? That we treat people humanely. And that's exactly what we're looking for here, right? We're looking for people to rise up again and say that that's what we need, right? That, the United States can have a system in which an asylum seeker comes to this country. We can treat them humanely. We can evaluate their refugee claim and decide whether or not that person, is deserving of protection here at the United States, or if their protection claim doesn't rise to the level of being a refugee. And that being at the legitimate definition of a refugee, not the one in which Trump sort of stripped out everybody who should be eligible for refugee status in this country. And so I think it's going to be critically important that those voices that rose up for against family separation, against kids in cages, are outspoken again about this idea that this is not a system by which people hoodwink us into being able to stay here. These are people who have fled persecution. We should treat them humanely and not return them to persecution. And so try and drown out those voices who are just basically anti-immigrant and are not interested in treating people humanely and allowing our process to work. So I'd say we're looking for those voices to come out again with the start of a new Biden administration to sort of show that's who we are and that's who we should be.
Great, thank you. So one more question for both of you as we think about what it means. I've mentioned a lot about recasting a vision because I think it's really important that we don't just go back to Obama era, right? That we, the baseline is to overturn the Muslim ban, to restore the number of refugee arrivals. But what are some of the policy changes that you would like to see that help to recast that vision, that really help us to live up to those aspirational values of truly being a beacon of hope for everyone?
So I would say one of the things that we talk about in the asylum context is that we must lead by example. If we expect other countries to treat people humanely and offer protection to refugees, then we have to set that example by what it is that we do. So in the asylum context, many people will remember that there was a crisis, at the border in 2014, in which we had an overwhelming number of unaccompanied children arrive. We had families arrive, and it was the Obama administration that started family detention. And the deportation numbers under Obama were alarmingly high. The use of detention, the use of expedited removal was very high. And I think that all of us share that your comments that we do not want to go back to the way things were under Obama. We do not want to see the detention of asylum seekers. We do not want to see family detention. We want to see better treatment of unaccompanied children who come here, right? And if we do better by them, if we have a humane system, then that's something we can ask of other countries, right? And as Adam pointed to earlier, you can't be taken seriously on the world stage and asking other countries to do their part if we're not doing right by asylum seekers and refugees.
And I'll add on the refugee side, the decimation of this program down to a goal of 15,000 that the administration is not even set up to meet were they to have continued in office in a fair way. And the aspirations of getting to 100,000 or more is a huge stretch, the likes of which we've not done in a short amount of time. So the crisis of an opportunity and the crisis of rebuilding is to be rebuilding differently, to be innovative, to be discussing different practices, different types of service delivery, to involve the experiential voice. It also means contemplating how we embed community engagement into the programs through more community sponsorship efforts, working with local nonprofits, extending service delivery beyond even just the affiliate footprints. It's also going to be important, I think, to an important opportunity to better measure goals, right? These programs are designed for self-sufficiency in a world where self-sufficiency is reductive and setting up individuals not to meet their own goals, let alone long-term benefits for their families in the way that they could be. We have an opportunity, I think, to redesign and think about these programs from the origin, from the overseas through the pipeline on inclusion, on belonging, on long-term aspirations. And I'm buffeted by the fact that other agencies in government, particularly the Department of Labor, are moving toward longer-term skills development, career pathways, while a lot of the funding pots in the resettlement realm are still very much on the short-term self-sufficiency. So I think there's an opportunity to wield these big apparatuses in favor of better long-term integration outcomes and really work in partnership with states and refugee coordinators and nonprofit organizations in new ways that embed these communities more fulsomely into the community, engage more community partners, and focus on the long term as opposed to the short.
Thank you both. Just hearing sort of your discussion and the things that you just shared gives me a lot of hope for the future, and I'm really excited for what it's going to be like to be able to not just defend against all of these attacks, but really work together to rebuild back and build back stronger and better than ever. So I want to turn now to Oscar to share with us a little bit about temporary protected status, what has happened to the program over the past 4 years, and especially right now as we've seen the impact of hurricanes in Central America that have just devastated parts of Guatemala, where my family is, and Nicaragua and other places. There's just even a greater need for temporary protected status than we've seen before. So why don't you share with us a little bit about your work with Alianza and the work to ensure that TPS continues?
Absolutely. Thank you, Lisa. And I appreciate also the context already set up by both Jennifer and Adam, because I believe it lends well to be able to talk about something like temporary protected status. And let me begin by saying that the common denominator, when we talk about the issue of temporary protected status, or TPS, and asylum seekers and refugees seeking to be resettled in the US, is one that we sometimes ignore. And I want to specifically focus on the past 40 years. I mean, the common denominator is that whether they are asylum seekers, refugees seeking resettlement, immigrants arriving to the US, people who have seen their lives completely destroyed, by natural disasters associated with climate change, is that by and large, we are talking about people of color, non-white folks that are trying to, again, seek humanitarian protection, support, resettlement in the US. And that is important because I believe that the narrative that has dominated the conversation about immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers has been so incredibly toxic, essentially painting these folks as if they were some sort of threat, to the country, makes a difference. And I just want to highlight that particular aspect as one that is also in the context of temporary protected status. I also want to highlight the fact that part of the narrative has also been to basically blame foreign nationals, irrespective to whether they are immigrant, refugees, or asylum seekers, for whatever ills are going on in the country. And in particular, I think that as economic inequality has become so rampant in the US, very often the narrative goes to say that it is these foreign nationals, that are trying to come into the country that are to be held accountable, for the fact that people are having more difficulties to make ends meet. And again, all that are lies. And I think we need to be very forceful going forward in challenging and demanding that there is a new, actually truth-based narrative behind all these issues that we are talking about. TPS actually connects very well with the issue of asylum seekers, with the issue of refugees. Let me just remind everybody who's viewing this particular panel that temporary protected status came into place in 1990. And it came into place precisely after a decade in which asylum seekers from Central American countries in particular were systematically denied asylum in the US. And 1990 came about, different events were in place. Temporary protected status was created as part of US immigration law. And the fact is that the program is intended indeed to protect people temporarily. But the problem comes in when the countries these people are coming from and the conditions that have made them be in the US at a moment where it's no longer safe for them to go back, which is one of the critical characteristics of temporary protected status, is that the condition goes for many, many years. And as people go for many years, sometimes up to 20 or more years, under so-called temporary protected status, this is an intersection with immigration law where we have a very bad combination. Because the reality is nobody who has been in the US for 3 or more years is really temporary anymore. And we should actually have built into our US immigration law a mechanism that allows people to seek adjustment of status into an immigrant visa condition, or otherwise known as permanent residency or green cards in the US. But that doesn't exist. And that's what creates the problem, because right now, TPS presents us with two challenges. The first challenge is actually, how do we really provide people who have been in the US for so many years, renewing work permits, renewing their status periodically, paying tons of money in fees, but only to be kept on a so-called temporary basis in the US. We should have come about with a solution for this dilemma long ago, but here we are at the end of 2020 without a solution. And in this respect, today, we have nearly 400,000 people from various countries, primarily from El Salvador, Honduras, Haiti, Nicaragua, and several other nations that have actually been in the US for decades. And yet, they are still under a so-called temporary protection program. And so it is about time that we find the courage to actually put a remedy, to this situation and provide people an opportunity to apply for legal permanent residency status. The other challenge is the one that you were referring to, Lisa. We are seeing right now a major destruction of Central American basic economic infrastructure, which is going to affect the lives of millions of people. And this is exactly the condition for which temporary protected status was actually created. So going forward, this is one of the demands that we will be making from the current administration, but we know that that will go into deaf ears, but certainly into the incoming administration, for a fresh look at the merits to actually grant, once again, temporary protected status for people from Central American countries, precisely in face of the reality that you described earlier, and that I can tell you for sure that I've been very, very involved with over the past 2-3 weeks, trying to literally raise a lot of money to actually support victims of these storms in Central America. So from our perspective, again, both of these issues are issues that are urgently needed. On the first one, what we really need is the courage of the president to keep people protected, both the TPS, but also the DACA recipients, but also the exploration of the merit of granting, as I said, a brand new TPS to protect people who are now in a situation where it is impossible, basically, to go back to their home countries. So I would leave it there for now, and I hope that we can go into more details in questions that you may have.
Thank you, Oscar. So you've been organizing around TPS for a long time now and had tremendous success in holding the line and making sure that TPS could continue as much as possible in the Trump administration. Would love to hear a little bit more about some of the lessons that you have learned over the past 4 years and what gives you hope.
Well, one of the biggest lessons, which at the same time is a source of hope, is the fact that the more that we can promote direct, meaningful contact between people who are recipients of TPS and people who care, minimally at least, about immigrants, the more success that we can get. because once people understand the fact that these are people who are, by all, a stretch of the imagination, permanent residents. I mean, they're here, they're allowed to work, they pay taxes, they raise families, they buy homes, they develop business throughout the country. People understand, I mean, that what it is common sense to do for them is to create a pathway for them to be able to overcome the temporariness of their status and to actually become fully integrated immigrants. And that basically means, holders of permanent residency visas, which sometime in the future will allow them the option to apply, for citizenship. And that is the kind of hope that we have, that both at the local, state level, there are so many people who have actually made their support very tangible by going and meeting with their congressional representatives at the local level, by having so many allies, especially in faith-based communities, also turn out and become much more outspoken about these issues in ways that we weren't really seeing before. And I have to say, I mean, that again, it's sad for me to admit that we still have a lot of work to do. A lot of members of Congress still do not know what temporary protected status is or why these people have been for so long. One of the most interesting questions we face when we do visits in congressional offices is to say, well, if they've been here for 20 years, why haven't they become citizens? I mean, as if it were that simple. I mean, and it basically becomes an opportunity, to educate people who really don't know much about our broken immigration policy, so that they can understand why there is such a need for profound, significant changes that can actually fix what's broken. And there is a lot broken with our current immigration policy.
Thank you, Oscar. Yeah, that has been our experience here as well. Is everyone knows what DACA is, but it has taken a lot of effort to try and educate and inform people about TPS and to organize TPS recipients and to empower them to share their stories and to speak to the media. But I think over the last 4 years, we've been able to build incredible power in doing that, and have really seen the TPS community come out to defend their families and their ability to stay here in their home. Mm-hmm. So as we look to the Biden administration, what do you think are the most important things that the Biden administration can do to ensure that we're able to deliver on the expectations immigrants and asylum seekers have for the incoming administration?
Well, on the TPS recipients and asylum seekers, I mean, I'll focus on the TPS recipients simply because Jennifer covered a lot of terrain regarding, what the expectations are when it comes to asylum seekers. I will only say, I mean, that I believe we are absolutely in a moment where the proper thing to do would be to restore anew our commitment to provide humanitarian protection and to really allow people who deserve protection, who deserve support, to be able to pursue that option in the U.S. and not fool ourselves, I mean, with programs like Remain in Mexico, or even worse, the so-called third country asylum agreements, which are literally a joke from the point of view of humanitarian protection. But on the TPS population, there are basically 2-3 challenges that I believe are absolutely crucial. The first challenge is, how do we keep people who are still protected to this day remain protected? And for that, I mean, I think there will be a need for creativity in terms of how to use administrative power, executive power that the office of the president does carry, as we have learned with Donald Trump. But in this case, to be used for the benefit of people who are very worried that they may find themselves all of a sudden without a status and even subjected, I mean, to potential deportations. So that is an urgent thing that we need to address. The second thing we need to address is the question of, can we provide protection, to people who need protection today, based on the reality on the ground in many Central American countries, following several weather events that have been extremely catastrophic for different countries. And I think that the law is on the side of the president. TPS is very clearly a program where the president can take action. so long as they can establish that the reality they're trying to address merits, this kind of decision. And so we are going to be pushing for that for sure. And I think that the third challenge, which is more complicated, is how can we bring about changes in the law that actually permit people who have been for a long time beneficiaries of a so-called temporary program to seek adjustment of status based on the number of years that they have been recipients of TPS or other forms of similar protections. And on this last point, I am fully aware that we are yet to decide the future of the Senate in as far as what the correlation of force there will be. And so we will need to be very creative in how to craft strategies that allow us to pursue legislative solutions that are more along the line of gradual, incremental, progressive changes that allow us to address highly meritorious cases like the DACA recipients, like the TPS recipients, and other specific groups that, in my view, deserve protection yesterday, deserve the opportunity to be invited to apply for permanent residency status. And here we are still without any solution along those lines.
Thank you, Oscar, for sharing your insight and for all of your work that you've been doing and to ensure that TPS isn't lost in the news and to fight for not just current TPS holders, but extending TPS to other countries and other communities who need it in this moment. We deeply appreciate it. So I want to turn to Nejra, who I remember, Nejra, just a few years back getting a call from you about organizing a Refugee Day on the Hill in Arizona. And you have been working now for a couple of years and building power at the local level. And we've seen the impact of your work and the work of others who have been organizing in Arizona for many, many years, playing defense, but all the while organizing directly impacted folks and transforming the state of Arizona into being a key player in this year's election. So I want to turn it over to you and hear about the amazing work that has been happening with refugee organizing at the local, state, and national level.
Thanks, Lisa. Thank you for having me here on this wonderful discussion panel. It's really great to be here. My name is Nejra Sumic, and I'm actually a former refugee myself from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I currently reside in sunny Phoenix, Arizona. I was a former state organizer here in Arizona, but in my recent role, I'm a national field organizer manager with We're All America campaign. So just to give a little bit of background about We're All America, our mission is to uphold and strengthen our nation's commitment to welcome and protect those who are seeking safety and refuge in this country. And we organize people across religious and cultural differences to build inclusivity and communities where everyone feels like they belong. And really over the past several years, We're All America has led the emergence of an effective national organizing infrastructure that has truly mobilized public support for people fleeing violence and persecution, counter-nativist forces, and we've really been able to develop more welcoming policies and practices in this areas, not only at the state, but also at the, not only at the federal, but also at the state and local level. And along with national partners, including organizations such as Church World Service, National Partnership for New Americans, Refugee Congress, Refugee Council USA, Alianza, Américas, International Rescue Committee, among many other partners, we have been able to significantly increase the number of state-based organizers from 5 states in 2017 to now over 20 states by 2020, which is really incredible. And our collective field represents the largest national grassroots organizing effort on behalf of refugees and asylees in the nation. Largely composed of organizers who themselves are asylees and refugees and have come to the US and are overwhelmingly Middle Eastern, African, and or American, Muslim Americans. So that's a little bit about the We Are All America campaign. And now let me talk about the current times and what it means to move our communities forward. And I know, Lisa, you were able to kind of give a state of play and Adam and Jennifer and Oscar were able to talk about what it takes to restore some of these programs. But with the changes now happening at the federal level post-election, clearly we are optimistic. This certainly puts us in a better position than we have been in the last 4 years. However, even though we have a new administration, the work must not stop. The anti-Muslim, the anti-refugee, the anti-immigrant movement that Donald Trump put into the White House and instilled in the White House is still out there, backed by money, by policy think tanks, and elected leaders at all levels. And what this means is a couple of things. Number one, we need to continue to push for grassroots efforts and policy change at the local and state level. Policies that are inclusive of refugee and immigrant communities. But we must also be mindful that the anti-refugee and anti-immigrant movement is likely to move back into state and local politics, and we must defeat regressive measures. Number two, we need to build a movement together that will shift the narrative of how refugee and immigrants are viewed in this country. So we are contributors and part of the American family. We are not the other. We are all America, right? And the third point I'll make is we need to have representation and leadership of refugees, asylees, and immigrants at the table, since we are the ones impacted. And just to elaborate a little bit on that last point, one of the ways that We Are All America is doing this is by launching a really exciting and vibrant campaign called Opportunity for All for 2021. And the goal of this campaign is to build and support for, and with the leadership of refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrants, with organizing and victories at the local, state, and federal level. And this campaign is really comprised of two principles. One is economic opportunity and equitable recovery, and two, the United States being a nation of refuge, promise, and hope, as we have known it to be traditionally, right? So right now, we are building out a national refugee and immigrant-led steering committee. This is a real campaign led by real impacted people. And after the last 4 years that we've had, we simply just cannot afford to have history itself repeat again. Back to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Nejra. I couldn't agree more. It's something that we've been thinking about a lot as these national policy changes are going to be happening. It's here in the states and at the local level where we're really going to feel that backlash. And so it's so important that that investment and those efforts at the administration, at the administrator level, are also happening here on the ground, that we are doing the work to soften the ground and to build support for the long term, as Adam mentioned. In 2015, with the backlash against refugees after the Paris attacks, there are a lot of lessons for the resettlement community. The importance of doing advocacy and building power and working with local communities. So would love to hear from you about why this type of organizing and advocacy efforts are so important in this work.
Well, we have seen time and time again how effective community organizing, grassroots efforts, and advocacy can be. So I'm just going to give a few brief examples of how impactful organizing is. In early 2020, in collaboration with multiple organizations, we ensured, and this is something Adam talked about earlier, that governors and local elected officials consented to resettle refugees. And this was a requirement of President Trump's Executive Order 13888 that was issued in September 2019. And really thanks to the hard work of local organizers and many, many allies, not only at the national level, but locally, we were able to get 43 governors and nearly 100 local jurisdictions across the country and across party lines to renew their historic commitment to refugee resettlement in a stunning rebuke of the administration's divisive executive order. And that was thanks to organizing work. And in addition to that, throughout this pandemic, throughout the COVID pandemic, organizing efforts have led to mobilizing state and local responses, including advocating for immediate licensing for immigrant and refugee healthcare professionals to respond during COVID, and budget advocacy in states and localities for refugees and asylees, asylum seekers that were not included in the CARES Act support. And in some areas, our work has led to even emergency funding for refugee families. For example, here in the city of Phoenix, we were able to organize and get $3 million obtained from the city of Phoenix of emergency refugee COVID relief funds. And then lastly, I'll mention that the New American Voters campaign, where multiple organizations led the national local efforts to register to vote and get naturalized citizens, including former refugees, out to the polls this election. And this was a tremendous impact that had a tremendous effort that had a big impact on this election, and particularly in states like Arizona, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So with that being said, I just want to conclude by saying that, you know, the fight must continue against Islamophobia, against anti-refugee and anti-immigrant rhetoric and hate. And we need to continue to offer on-the-ground opportunities for grassroots action, local driven organizing campaigns, and ultimately upholding and strengthening our nation's commitment to welcome and protect those seeking freedom, safety, and refuge in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Nejra. And I think a real clear example of everything that you talked about is thinking back to 2015, and that half the governors in the country had spoken out rejecting Syrian refugees. But then there was a deep investment in that grassroots organizing and building power, that when governors were asked again last year about their willingness to welcome refugees, we succeeded in an overwhelming number of governors saying yes to refugee resettlement. And that was because of the investment and the work of folks on the ground who were building support and who were advocating for the program and for keeping refugee families together. So I want to thank all of the panelists today. I hope that everybody feels inspired and hopeful about the future in the same way that I do. And a little bit closer to being able to meet that aspirational value of being a beacon of hope and a place for refuge for people who are fleeing persecution, violence, natural disasters. But we do have a long history of keeping people out, especially Black and Brown communities. And it's going to take a lot of work to change our systems and our laws to achieve our aspirational goal. And so, as Nejra said, the fight continues. It's not over with this administration. We want to ensure that we never experience the kind of attacks that we did over the last 4 years. And so it's going to take all of us, all of our hard work, the investment and the infrastructure and the capacity to welcome, investment in working with local communities to increase support for refugees, asylum seekers, TPS holders, and others, and the investment in organizing these communities. The last 4 years, we have had really incredible opportunities to organize these communities. And now we need to be sure that we are working to build a better future. We have a deep bench now of refugee leaders, asylees, TPS holders who are ready to take on more, to run for office, to shape the future, to change our immigration system to live up to our fundamental values. And so we're thankful for all of our speakers and all of you tonight for all of that work that you're doing and the work that you'll continue to do. To the NPNA and NICS staff, who I know was no easy feat putting together a virtual conference under these conditions, but so grateful for the space that they've been able to create to have these important discussions. And all of you who are wondering, how can we plug in? What comes next in 2021? There'll be a follow-up email from the NIC, from the folks at NPNA and the steering committee and others with opportunities on how to plug in. So thank you all so much for joining us today. We're incredibly grateful, and we hope to see you at the NIC next year in Las Vegas.